pride in which you talked about your very intelligent, educated daughters. We hope that the men will be lining up to marry them soon. This is one of the most fundamental paradoxes of this whole gender agenda, that while men push their daughters to become educated, they are not in any hurry to get married to those educated young ladies. Ladies and gentlemen, the lady in question from the PNM Internal Elections is actually here with us. I'd like you all to welcome Mrs. Penalty Letters. We also have some other distinguished members of the audience. Mr. Rick Kind from the German Embassy. He is the Deputy Head of Mission. Mr. Kind, welcome also to our forum. Our professors and emeritus professors are Professor Quincy Samaru and Professor Selwyn Ryan. And of course, the head of the Institute of Gender and Development Studies, Professor Valerie Yusuf. Welcome, thank you all for being here. Let's move on. Our next panelist is Dr. Paula Morgan, a senior lecturer in the Department of Literary, Cultural and Communication Studies at UB St. Augustine. The primary focus of research, teaching and publication has been cultural representations, periodic strategies on gender and societal violence in literacy and popular discourse of the Caribbean and its diasporas. Dr. Morgan has published numerous scholarly articles and has written, edited, and/or collaborated on several books, length texts, and journal issues. Dr. Morgan also served as a member of the founding national executive of the Congress of the People as a Secretary for Communications. Dr. Morgan, welcome.
Well, it's an utter delight to follow after Dr. James. Since I'm a lady wearing skirts, I can't just go down there and sit down, constrained as we are all the while by issues of gender. I would like to, what I'm going to do is to look at some little bits of discourse, starting with a bit that is now, I suppose, historical, and then coming to the contemporary, to see what is happening with this issue of women and political power, a right to lead. If you promise not to run away, I'll start by singing to you. In a land that used to be strong, there's a woman wearing the crown and another one boss in the town. London Bridge is falling down, I say falling down. London Bridge is falling down. I don't know who's old enough to remember that. 1979. This popular calypso commenting on the rule of Queen Elizabeth and the symbolically enamored Iron Lady, Lady Margaret Thatcher. Posits of men women govern in the Houses of Parliament and in the highest ceremonial offices. Once powerful imperial nations, the divine right of patriarchal rule and the natural order of things are ruptured. Public structures and icons of power are undermined. Emasculation, immorality, and contagion spread throughout the land. Expressions of public dissent against the right of women to political power are no longer politically appropriate. If that song was sung today, it would raise issues. But contemporary discourses nevertheless reveal that the underlying fears, prejudices, and mistrust of female rule remain very much alive and well today. I am grateful for the opportunity offered by the Institute, to offer a few exploratory comments this morning on women in politics. And I'm just going to talk about a right to rule because, and a right to rule despite of. And since there are no rights without responsibilities, I'll also say a brief word on the requirement to rule responsibly. I am defining politics in this narrow sense as the activities associated with the governance of a nation, and in its broad sense as indicated by its Greek derivative meaning of, for, and related to citizens. So we start with a right to rule because Women have a right to rule because any democratic system based on representation cannot exclude or underrepresent upwards of 50% of its citizenry. And those figures that Dr. James spoke about, if you were to get more precise, the Interparliamentary Union Global Classification of Women Elected to Parliament ranks our nation, Trinidad and Tobago, as 37th globally in terms of the proportion of women elected to the lower house of Parliament. The female to male ratio is 28.6%, and that is as of January 2014. 28.6% indicates to us we got a long way to go. Disproportionate representation in democratic societies is unjust and disempowering, not simply to women, but to the entire socio-political order. Put another way, we cannot build a just society when the voices, perspectives, and worldviews of women are disproportionately represented in the corridors of power. When the issues and vulnerabilities of women are rendered invisible or are inadequately addressed in legislative sphere and social support systems. When the collective hopes, dreams, and aspirations of women are flouted within societal and institutional structures. Although proportionate representation is a significant global indicator, it can only be but a start. And I see that Ryder is here, and I quote from her essay in the Trinidad Guardian, which was part of an assessment on how well we had progressed, indicators of our progress as a result of the 50th anniversary independence. And she raised the question in July 2012. Has increasing numbers of women in Parliament resulted in more women-friendly policies and greater equity between men and women in society? Going beyond access as an end in itself, Sudhir quotes Srilata Bhattiwala's definition of women's transformational leadership. And it's there for you. It's defined as women with a vision of social justice, individually and collectively, and note that is necessary for both, individually and collectively, transforming themselves to use their power, resources, and skills in non-oppressive, inclusive structures and processes to mobilize others around a shared agenda of social, cultural, economic, and political transformation for equality and the realization of human rights for all. It will take us a long time to unpack that definition, and time doesn't allow, but I put it up there for you to look at notions of individuality and collectivity, personal growth and growth of the body politic, to look at personal development processes and mobilizing around social agendas, to look at the role of women as defined here in terms of transformation for equality and the realization of human rights, not for women, but for all. Women have a right to rule, I say, and here I risk opening the essentialism, constructivism can of worms, but it's okay. For by virtue of their femaleness, I believe, as well as their socialization, they are more inclined towards communication and conciliation than silence and adversarial relations. They are more inclined to embrace collaboration and teamwork than competition. In response to biological and childbearing cycles, they bring sensitivity to nature and cyclic time, the capacity to nurture a seed and bring it to fruition. And cross-sections of Caribbean women in particular, by virtue of centuries of marginalization and lack of access to financial resources, have learned to be innovative, creative, to be frugal, and to make do. All of these skills are greatly needed in our political arena today. Some of these notions have come to public attention through not sexy Kamla, I don't have that privilege, so I will say Prime Minister Kamla Persad-Bissessa's statement on constraints and expectations placed on female parliamentarians. In her address at the 3rd Regional Conference of the Commonwealth Women's Parliamentarians of the Caribbean, Americas, and the Atlantic region, she indicated, it seems that she is a female parliamentarian, is required to be genderless in her speech and manners, perhaps even to curb her feminine nature. The desire to make women politicians feel as though they are somewhere they do not belong, or to want to see them behave in ways that are not natural to them, is a difficulty that women politicians must overcome. So she is speaking here presumably out of her experiential reality of trying to fight and to battle away into, and again I think there is there was a sense in the longer statement of the combative nature of just finding a place within this forum as a woman, and then having gotten there by virtue of struggle, how to maintain her sense of being a woman and her notion of how to retain how she sees herself as a woman in that space. So I believe that these issues are still, there's still much for us to struggle with these issues. Women have a right to rule because of the perspectives they can bring to the entire slate of governmental issues. Not just the soft sectors, not just education, not just the social sectors, not just the caring sectors, but all of the sectors, energy and economics and all of the sectors, foreign affairs. However, and I don't want this to seem like a contradiction, even though women do have a right to govern and to have a say on all of the sectors, they also stand to bring a sensitivity which is often experientially crafted to the myriad issues impacting women, the vulnerability of women and men to disempowering constructions of masculinity and femininity, the subordination and unfair treatment of women in the home, disrespect and lack of provision for the aged and infirm, which places a heavy burden on women caregivers within the home, gender-based violence, sexual victimization and abuse of all forms, vulnerability of girls in relationships, teenage pregnancy, maternal abandonment, impoverished single motherhood, and the list goes on. Women in power are also well poised to lobby for enhanced literacy, education, and dignified employment for women, protection and care for children, poverty alleviation, positive media representations of women, women's contribution to the establishment of new financial and economic models, promoting women's involvement in a gender perspective in multilateral negotiations, and here again, the list goes on. So let me go on to speak briefly on a right to lead despite contemporary discourses on gender inequity, including the discredited but the persistent veiled marginalization contention argues that women have overtaken men or stand to overtake men in terms of access to education and job opportunities, and I think that Dr. James, told us some of this stuff. And the ascension to public office. But what happens in terms of how discourse is constituted is that every ascension of every highly placed and visible woman in public office is read as a sure sign that women need to be constrained lest London Bridge does indeed fall down. The contention goes to give women any more space will be to damage the social fabric irreparably. Establishment and acceptability of women in leadership is not a gender issue. It is a human issue. And it is not simply a secular issue. And here I agree with Dr. James. It is also a spiritual issue, which should be engaged through every avenue of socialization, including our churches, mosques, and mandirs. Within my own belief system, women were created unique and equal and given divine mandate to rule as co-regents. We say it all the time. God made man and woman, male and female, he made them, and he said, let them rule. And I long to see these writings and those of other sacred texts explored among the believers to produce a more nuanced understanding of what various spiritual cosmologies can bring to our multicultural table. The contemporary discourse also goes, we currently have a female prime minister, hence we are giving women the chance. As soon as she goes, it's time to put things back in their proper order and move on. This cannot be about highly visible representative women. Put another way, a highly visible representative of a minority still can potentially be a token. Beyond tokenism, there is the genuine incorporation of women within every domain of leadership, and even women courageously influencing political processes outside of the corridors of power. The ongoing impulse towards preserving gender inequity is based on fear of difference and increasingly fear of reprisal. I recently heard a prominent male leader and educator bemoan the potential tragedy which can occur when men accused of rape are constrained to face a female-dominated court system. He spoke with complete sincerity and deep conviction, and no recognition whatsoever of the tragic ironies reflected in such a stance. And this brings me to a key point, and I'm going to slow down because I just want everybody to hear the key point of what I want to say to you. The fundamental conception I posit is that hierarchical relations, which will always be inherent to the human social order, are of necessity dominance relations. The persons in the hegemonic positions will of necessity oppress persons of lower strata in the power echelons. The persons and or gender at the helm will institute institutional and judicial power to establish and institutionalize unjust hierarchies which are detrimental to the other. If we debunk that assumption, then maybe we have a basis to ask ourselves, can women who have for centuries been at the receiving end of such injustice dare to affirm the possibility and to implement a better way? Coming to a close now, in Trinidad and Tobago, women have been at the backbone of political parties and largely accepted their roles as supporters of male-dominated policies. We are only now transcending the economic, cultural, psychological, and ideological barriers to seeking top-level leadership. Do our women who have practiced collaboration across barriers of race, class, and ethnicity possess the will and courage to break the male-dominated, tribally oriented party system which has dominated electoral politics from its inception until today? We started with Sparrow's commentary on the travesty of women assuming rule over former empires. I will end these brief comments with a literary commentary. George Lamming, a native of my person, writes an originary narrative which explores the roots of the common Caribbean, or the modern Caribbean nation states. The crew of the slave ship Reconnaissance, recognizing the immorality of the enterprise of the Indies, breaks away from the colonizing kingdom in the hope of establishing a more equitable social order. They are destined to fail because they are unable to come to terms with their past and with the injustice and inequities embedded in their relationships with their women. Natives of my person demonstrates the futility of all forms of revolution which preserve gender oppressions intact. Lamming is working towards an articulation of the centrality of women in the task of effective nation building. Last slide. Oh, second to last. Indeed, he argues, in the same way as the conquistadors' will to power guarantees the unleashing of sexual violence and mayhem, The inability of the conquistadors, who he parallels the contemporary nation builders at the time of writing, this book was written and published around the independence, the period of the independence movement. The inability of the conquistadors to embrace female potentiality and complementarity guarantees the failure of their new enterprise. Laming, putting a focus on how the private becomes political, explains if a man-woman relationship is aborted, is perverted, there will be a corresponding perversion in the relationship between man and what he calls his work or his conception of fulfillment. The corruption of the individual man-woman relationship, these are the symptoms of a wider and more pervasive corruption in the society in which they live. The text ends with a statement. New slide. Women are the future, they must learn. And I am of the view that female involvement in the political arena in every dimension, not simply in the corridors of power, and the kind of courageous intervention that we see pictured there that we don't have time to talk about, that female intervention is set on a growth trajectory which cannot be ruptured. The swift progress and accurate positioning of that trajectory requires a collective embrace of women on behalf of both men and women. But we must all collectively embrace the reality that women are our future. We must learn. Thank you so much.